Indeed it is. So that, and as Stephen has said in the sessions, and I'm sure other people have said, so that when they upload it, when we're finished, people from other time zones are able to see it and to enjoy our presentations. I say our because I'm presenting in this one as well. Let me introduce myself very briefly. I'm Audra Deers Lawson, and I am chairing this session. And so as we begin, it looks like because we have 3 presentations, we'll have about 15-20 minutes for each of our presentations, and then that leaves us about 15 minutes for general questions and conversation thereafter. And with that, we will just go in order that's in the program. So I will go first. And let me see, where's my share? I just have to find the share my stuff. We don't use Zoom as much as we use other things, so I'm trying to find how to share my screen. I have done it before. The share screen, that would be the obvious way to do it. All right. And so let's see, whoops. So this piece of research for me, and I know my camera, it will occasionally blink out as I use different kinds of things. But this piece of research for me has actually been quite an interesting journey. My husband is Scottish, and he's also quite passionate about Scottish independence and helped me with some of the research, mostly on the quantitative side of the piece. This piece in and of itself is a qualitative one, but we're looking at this question of how in the United Kingdom, what is the likelihood and what are the factors leading to potentially another independence vote and the degree to which it might be successful. So one of the things that is probably going to need a little bit of clarification is the context. The United Kingdom, and this is something, if you've ever used British and English interchangeably, which a lot of people, including in this country, do, if you've ever used Great Britain and the United Kingdom interchangeably, which frankly we all do on a daily basis, it's not necessarily reflective of the technically correct terms. So the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is really an amalgamation of 4 countries. And it's one with a rich and kind of complex and nearly colonial history. And actress Tilda Swinton talked about being British as being a strictly for export term, because while there are some people who will genuinely refer to themselves as British, most people's other identities emerge much more strongly, and it's because of the history within the UK and the degree to which, whether you are English and representing a substantial majority of the population in the UK, or whether you're Scottish, Northern Irish, or Welsh, will depend on your social and your political attitudes and ideologies, and it's very much centered on this very tumultuous kind of history. So the question in a lot of cases is that whether Scotland is interested in independence and their position on independence, this movement is pretty much as old as Scotland itself, and as as old as the United Kingdom itself. Because when the unification of the crowns, and the United Kingdom is really about the unification of the Scottish and the English crowns, because Ireland and Wales were already owned by England at that point, was met in opposition. There are about 100 posh people who in Scotland who in 1707, and I actually remember the date because I had to learn it for my knowledge test for living in the UK. But there are about 100 people in Scotland who made the decision to unify the crown. And so there was opposition to that from the get-go, and there's been opposition over years. But In the 20th century, the emergence of the identification of being British and then the re-emergence of a stronger Scottish independence movement has been one that's been quite interesting and ultimately led to a failed 2014 bid for independence or vote for independence within Scotland. One of the primary reasons that people voted no in 2014 was that they were afraid that they would be taken out of Europe and not be allowed back into the European Union. And from a Scottish perspective, being a member of Europe was a critical part of what they believed in and what mattered to them. Ironically, since then, the United Kingdom, meaning in this case England and Wales, voted against or voted for Brexit, and in the biggest act of self-inflicted harm, the UK is now outside the European Union, much to the chagrin of the Northern Irish and to the Scottish, who voted quite resoundingly in both countries to remain in. In a scoreboard, that's a 2-2 draw. In the reality of a country that has 10 times the population of Scotland, England, and if you combine Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, you still have significantly less. Those three combined come up to about, I think, 9 million people, somewhere around there. No, it's a little bit more than that, more like 11 million people. I'll do maths later, compared to the 55 million in England. This creates a democratic challenge within the United Kingdom because it doesn't actually matter what Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland care about. It is the will of the English that rules Britannia. So if you get a sense of this context, you get a sense of potentially some of the arguments and some of the challenges that emerge within this frame. But it wasn't quite enough. 300 years of an independence inclination and movement isn't enough. Even having the vote for independence isn't necessarily enough. So one of the things that when you look at the research on social movements and what predicates them is that in a lot of cases, crises themselves are the triggers for activism. If you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, the violence against African Americans in the United States was the trigger for the movement. Had injustice, and especially police injustice, been a norm, unfortunately, for Black Americans? Of course it had. But it takes the right situation at the right time and in a very public way to really spur a movement on. If you look historically in the United States, Rosa Parks and the bus, that was a trigger. Why? Because it created a very public and a very real crisis. Well, in Sandoval Almazan and Hugh Garcia's research on cyber activism in Latin America, what they found was that in a cyber context, for a 4-stage process, there was a triggering event, there was a traditional media response, there was virtual organization, and a physical response. What research on social movements is finding more and more and more these days is that there is a pretty direct relationship between online activism and real life activism, that in fact, a lot of the social movements may emerge online, but at some point that bleeds over into real activism. And it's to the contrary of how online activism is often portrayed as hacktivism or something that's not real. Now, in some cases, the online component doesn't necessarily shift into the real life, but in many it does. So in the Latin American social movements, we've seen this in terms of the Arab Spring, and certainly in a lot of other kinds of places, the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is part of the question. And in the UK, within Scotland, there's a very active virtual activist community, and there's also a very active independence movement, in part because the Scottish National Party which is the ruling party in Scotland, is a pro-independence party, and they have had for about the last, I think, 12 years, a stonking majority in the Scottish Parliament, meaning that even in a system that was designed for one party not to have a majority, they have the overwhelming vote share. Now, that said, this becomes the question is in you have the ruling party with something like a 58% majority vote as in terms of the popular vote majority. You have the hundreds of years of sort of this movement. And even with the election in 2014, the fear of change overwhelmed, and the fear of what they might lose overwhelmed the possibility for independence. So what, if anything, has changed now? And part of this is trying to understand what contributes to activism and what contributes to people being motivated to engage in activism and act. And there are a number of factors that end up converging with this. And so I'll give a quick overview to the unified model of activism. And this comes from research in Scotland, research on social movements globally. One of the key components, one of the key factors is a hostile media. This is the perception on the part of the activists that the media coverage is biased. In the case of Scotland, the media coverage from the dominant media within the UK, and most especially the BBC, in terms of independent analyses, the BBC, with regards to the question of Scotland, has been rated about as good as the tabloids in terms of the fairness and the balance in their coverage of Scottish independence. The second component is the historic problem recognition. There needs to be a long-seated history to lead to activism. So that's a necessary but not sufficient condition. There's also the notion that there is actually a problem. It's one thing to say, historically, has a group been denigrated? Has a group been downtrodden? It's another to say, do we feel it now? And so that's the difference between the historic problem recognition and the problem recognition. Then the constraints ask the question, how do we see the limitations on ourselves currently? The involvement, do we care about it? And of course, the affect of injustices, is there really something meaningful? Is there discrimination? Are there active acts of hostility towards it? Now, I argue, and this is part of the new component, is that you need a trigger. You need an immediate problem recognition to get people to motivated. And this is grounded in a lot of cases, if it feels a bit familiar, it's because it's grounded the situational motivation and problem solving in Grunig's theory, Grunig's situational theory. And then that leads to the online activism. So what I was interested in doing is seeing whether or not this kind of a model held up. So between June and October of last year, I talked to 26 yes, as in pro-independent Scots, and ahead of time, I've given them this list of themes. Now, what's interesting, so the folks I recruited were recruited off of Twitter for the most part. 23 of them were recruited off of Twitter, people that I had identified as influencers, as activists, and people with substantial followings and engagement. So it was one or both of those. They came from a diverse background, from working class to more white collar, what we'd say in the US, middle class folks. They came from a number of different ethnic, religious, social backgrounds. What they have in common was the fact that they were very strong yes advocates. The other three were people who were known to me, and people who I interviewed later in the project to reflect and see if I was getting the interpretation right. And then there was also a large body of this research that came with social media analysis in and of itself, which is we won't talk about that today, but that's where a lot of times my co-author came in because he devised the tool to help do the analysis of 300,000 tweets. But in the interviews alone, there was 32 hours of discussion. Once I got folks talking, and I started with a simple question: tell me why you care about independence. Um, and sometimes they chuckle. A lot of them just kind of chuckled at that and said, well, you started us off easy. But what was interesting was that despite this diverse background, that really the only thing a lot of these folks had in common was that they were pro-independence. I had thematic saturation after 10 interviews. Everything else other than the major themes that came up afterwards were simply variations on what the first 10 folks that I talked to referred to. Now, I know that this slide violates pretty much every decent rule of good slide construction, but I want to give you an overview of the big picture of the findings, and then I'll spend what's left of my time, a few minutes, kind of flipping through some of the critical quotations. The themes that emerged in terms of the hostile media perception was a clear bias, an anti-independence spin, and a negativity towards Scotland. And respondents gave a lot of different examples of that. There were also three components of affective injustice that they talked about. First was people that in their lives that they had seen talking down Scotland, which in a lot, and you'll see from a couple of the quotations, was a sense of a lot of negativity towards Scots and towards Scotland. But more than that, they gave specific examples of discrimination and bigotry. For example, at a whole company meeting, one Scot overheard their English boss saying, "I wish I didn't have to hire Scots. I prefer to hire the English." And this is from within your own country, arguably. But there are a lot of examples that people offered of this. And the other theme that came up was colonialism, that as a dominant theme, this came up that Scotland was simply another colonial, was the last bastion of the British Empire dying. The crisis is problem recognition, both Brexit and COVID, as you can see that from the bottom, those seem to be creating the trigger. So for about 6 months, the movement for supporting independence in terms of the polling was consistently up and up and up and up and up. And it's largely attributable, it is largely attributable in the literature to the Brexit situation and also to COVID, but for very different reasons. Brexit was about what Scotland didn't get, that Scotland's interests weren't attended to. COVID was basically a demonstration that, hey, Scotland could respond well, because in the UK, the health response is devolved, meaning that when you hear about the NHS and you hear about what Boris Johnson's doing to help address COVID, that's actually only really talking about NHS England. There's some caveats there, but for the most part, the way that it's been treated and dealt with is quite different, and they have different sets of options in terms of the four countries. But then on the activism and social media side, social media seems to be a place for community building and for information sharing. And then in terms of the hostile media, a couple of quotations that emerged was talking about the lack of independence of publications, and then affective injustice. This term, too poor, too weak, too stupid, came up over and over in the conversations. Like they had been told this, or that this is something they've talked about amongst themselves for quite some time, this notion of innate loathing. Just for quite quickly, I want to go through some of the examples of key quotations. When they talk about social media, you see this sense that social media is about interrogating the arguments for and against independence, and it's a fair representation of what goes on amongst the yes community. They also see themselves as translating their online activism to offline, and several of the participants talked about they couldn't wait until the COVID restrictions were lifted, because then they would be able to actually engage face to face. There was a sense of the immediate problem recognition with Brexit, and a sense of the contempt shown that Scotland was ignored. There was also a sense with the pandemic, like I mentioned, that quite frankly, in comparison, Scotland, what they felt was doing better, and that they could self-govern, that this is a good example of doing just that. In the hostile media perception, there were a number of different examples of that, and how, there wasn't a single indie person that I talked to that didn't say that there was a problem with the hostile media. A lot of different examples. In terms of affective injustice, the denigration, feeling like they've been told they're second best, has been a consistent theme for Scots. Likewise, there were examples of direct discrimination that, if we put this in a racial or in a religious context, would be illegal and would be prosecuted. Within the UK, it's just bans. And this notion of the last bastion of colonialism was mentioned over and over. But there's also this notion of the historic problem recognition, and how all of this translates, that for some, being Scottish translates as less official and less desirable. And this notion of the union of equals falling short was something that emerged quite clearly. But then there's also the involvement component, that instead of talking down Scotland, Scots should be talking up Scotland. But there's also this challenge of being Scottish. There's this cynicism that exists, even amongst the strongest yes supporters there. And also the question about the timing, and the question about whether it's sort of the alcoholic analogy. You have to hit rock bottom before you decide to make a change. And that came up time and time again with it. So in the big picture, the findings suggest that the unified model of activism works and needs to be further developed, but it provides a systematic way to evaluate social media. And for me, it also explores this notion of injustice beyond some of the traditional lines that we do, to understand that in a lot of places, different identities are simply going to face discrimination and prejudice in the same ways that some of the more obvious ones will emerge, but it's unexpected. So narratives of oppression and cultural disempowerment need to be more broadly explored in cultural studies. Thank you. And let me stop sharing. So we will move from that presentation. We'll move directly into Natalia's presentation on clarity and immediacy in technology, mediated communication between teachers and students in tertiary education in Russia. So we're getting quite a different set of reflections on this notion of intercultural. So Natalia, sorry, take over.
Well, thank you. Well, just a moment. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Well, let me start by saying just a few words about my own background. I'm a senior lecturer at National Research University, High School of Economics in Russia. As you can see on the screen, our topic today is clarity and immediacy in technology-mediated communication between teachers and students in tertiary education in Russia. I'd like to present the results of my research on the topic. I'm going to show you that the level of student communication satisfaction varies significantly depending on the level of perceived teacher clarity and immediacy. Today's topic is of particular interest to those of you who are involved in the education field, I think. My presentation will take about 15 minutes. Well, you may interrupt me at any moment to ask questions or to make comments. Sorry, just a moment. I've divided my presentation into 4 parts. I'll start off by saying some words about the background of the study. Then I'll focus on the study design and data analysis. After that, I'll go on to show the findings of the study. And finally, I'll highlight the implementations of the study findings. Well, according to the United Nations report, the COVID pandemic has created the largest disruption of the education system in history, affecting nearly 1.6 million learners in more than 190 countries and all continents. In higher education, the transition to remote learning and subsequent technology-mediated communication of teachers and their students was immediate. The geographic scale and speed at which the transitions occurred were unprecedented. All the technology-mediated communication has a lot of benefits, and I think it's a real way out at times of a pandemic. It can be not comfortable for some students. So student communication satisfaction is a matter of concern during the transition of learning from offline to online. Communication scholars have historically examined effective teaching behaviors that foster student effective behavioral cognitive learning. They also study communication processes in the classroom, student characteristics, and many other things. But studies discussing the most effective teacher communicative behaviors, which can strengthen student communication satisfaction in technology-mediated learning, are still relatively limited. The aim of our study was to analyze how historically prominent teacher communicative behaviors, such as clarity and immediacy, can be most effectively used in technology-mediated learning to enhance student communication satisfaction. Let's now move on to the study design and data analysis. To identify how far the level of student communication satisfaction varies depending on the level of perceived teacher clarity and immediacy, several semi-structured interviews were conducted. Qualitative research design with semi-structured interviews was chosen because it contributes to a deeper understanding of human condition in different contexts and of a perceived situation. The research took place at a national research university in a large metropolitan city in Russia. The data was collected from 43 Russian students of information technology and economics courses taught at the university. Students studied in Microsoft Teams classrooms. Microsoft Teams provided the framework that handled all aspects of learning process. The platform was also used to gather data and recruit participants. When the respondents answered the questions of the interviews, the data were coded and processed using MaxQDA 2020. The reporting codes were combined into the following categories, prompted by the research question and literature: clarity, immediacy, student communication satisfaction. Each category had several subcategories which were developed from the interview questions. Clarity was divided into such subcategories as major concepts, instructions, and examples. The codes were clear guidelines, simplicity, and explanations. The code explanations had two subcodes, case studies and visual cues. According to the analysis, the code explanations, including the subcodes, case studies, and visual cues, was identified in all the subcategories, and clear explanations of the major concepts was the most significant for students. Besides, the data confirmed the suggestion that in a technology-mediated environment, it's practically impossible for students to perceive information without visual cues, such as presentations, screen sharing, web-based media provided by the instructor. Immediacy was divided into such subcategories as communication channels available, teacher support, teacher feedback, and teachers' preferable channels of communication. On average, teachers used the same channels of communication which students identified as available. One of the most remarkable results to emerge from the data is that email was used much more often than other communication channels. The majority of respondents commented they felt that they felt their instructors' support more when they asked or were asked questions orally. It was perceived as their teacher caring attitude. However, with regard to teacher feedback, most participants indicated that instructors gave written comments in most cases. The fact is worth noting because such a discrepancy in means of communication can account for some situations when students are not satisfied with the communication between them and their teacher. Importantly, communication in online classes was mentioned as significant for all subcategories of teacher immediacy. So it can be chosen for asking and answering different questions, asking for and providing clarification on any topic in the technology-mediated environment. Students were also asked about their communication satisfaction in online classes. 48% of students explained that they had never come across situations when they were not satisfied with the communication with the instructor, whereas 32% of respondents were not satisfied in some cases. With regard to immediacy, the findings presented solid evidence of the students' strong desire to receive responses quickly, without any delays, and to have stable means of contacting their instructor. Otherwise, students felt neglected and had low communication satisfaction. With regard to clarity, the findings confirmed the need to provide clear explanations, very often oral explanations, combined with visual cues in the online learning process. Comparing clarity and immediacy categories, we can conclude that they are almost equally important for communication satisfaction in online classes. Finally, participants were asked about the main indicators of good communication between students and teachers. The majority commented that combination of mutual respect and understanding was essential. It's crucial to note that students mentioned the use of web cameras in addition to teacher feedback and clear guidelines in online classes as a prerequisite of successful teacher-student communication. Interestingly, students said they disliked cameras, but they were ready to switch cameras on to demonstrate their respect to teachers and to show they are interested in the subject. Students interested in the subjects Well, this brings me to the end of my presentation. And to conclude, I'd like to say that the present study explored the connection between such teacher communicative behaviors as clarity and immediacy and student communication satisfaction in the process of e-learning during the coronavirus pandemic in a Russian university. The findings suggest that teacher clarity and immediacy significantly affect student communication satisfaction in a technology-mediated learning environment. The high level of perceived teacher clarity and immediacy results in the high level of student communication satisfaction. Besides, we have obtained comprehensive results showing that teacher clarity and immediacy are reinforced by the use of IT elements and visual cues, such as presentations, screen sharing, web-based media, and documents uploaded onto web platforms. So to increase the level of student communication satisfaction in an online educational environment, it's recommended to take into account both the significance of teacher communicative behaviors and the use of IT elements and visual cues. Computer-mediated communication is a standard tool in education today. Well, and we should make it as comfortable, as convenient as possible for teachers and students. Well, as any research, our research has a number of limitations, but I hope it provides encouragement for a new way to analyze and organize teacher communication, teacher-student communication in the process of technology-mediated learning. Well, that's all. Thank you for listening. And now, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer. Well, thank you very much for your attention, for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And we'll actually hold the questions until the very end. But I would like to ask Svetlana now, I think, is our presenter to talk about chatbot as a communication tool.
Just a moment. Just a moment. Thank you very much. I am Svetlana Kiseleva. I am from St. Petersburg. I am a doctor of philology at St. Petersburg State University of Economics. And my presentation is performed with my postgraduate student, Anna Smirnova. So I will start and Anna will continue. So this is the point. And the topic of our presentation is chatbot as a communication tool. Communication as a two-way process of speech production and speech perception has always been of interest of linguistic researchers. The study of speech acts seems to be quite promising in connection with a wide area for researchers, covering extra-linguistic components such as machine translation, analysis of spoken discourse, natural speech synthesis, predicting the results of conversation with clients, and some others. Studies of speech acts are carried out on the material of various languages. A speech act includes not only linguistic elements, but also extra-linguistic ones, such as society, politics, psychology, technology, etc. The usual communication model where the sender and the addressee are individuals has become more complicated with the development of the market economy and the development of information technologies. At the moment, communication can be between an individual and a legal entity. The latter is the brand of the organization, product, and service. A speech act can occur between a person and an artificial intelligence like bot. So for linguists, this is a unique opportunity. Excuse me. So I couldn't hear the voice.
Don't worry about it. It was just an accidental microphone on.
I see. Okay. So excuse me. So for linguists, so this is a unique opportunity to study speech acts, texts, and discourse of communication between a person and a company, or a person and a bot, to determine whether there are significant differences in the processes of speech production and speech perception, to understand whether there are distinctive criteria for the success and non-success of speech acts, and under such conditions. The study of communication on the internet is of great interest and importance. The term internet linguistics, which was introduced by David Crystal, denotes the specifics of linguistic processes in such a channel of information transmission as the internet. Even in his book, there is a reference to so-called communication with a machine. For example, navigators in car systems, washing machines with voice control, etc. And since 2011, technology has advanced quite a lot. Today, we are talking about more complex algorithms, such as chat bots. At the moment, there are different interpretations of the term chatbot. So, semantic, sites for data research, marketing, PR, advertising, and social media marketing give the following definition. A chatbot is a special program with which a user can communicate. And according to Oxford Dictionary, a chatbot has the following definition, like a computer program designed to create an imitation of a user's conversation with another interlocutor on the internet. This history of this phenomenon began in the middle of the last century. The attempts were made to create artificial intelligences capable of communicating with people, as well as understanding their most primitive commands. ELIZA, virtual interlocutor, SHRDLU program, ALICE. It is thanks to these developments that today we have voice assistants, Siri, Alice, Google Assistant, Alexa, etc. Almost every smart device has its own voice assistant algorithm, which is in a smartphone or a TV set box. Artificial intelligence requires well-coordinated work of not only development teams, IT specialists, but also linguists. The linguistic component helps to humanize the image of the virtual interlocutor thanks to the cognitive features of customized speech. Let's consider the example of the voice assistant, Alice. She can absolutely calmly maintain a conversation on various topics with the interlocutor and accordingly imitate a conversation between two people. Specificity is determined by the algorithm of a computer program in connection with various speech patterns embedded in it. voice assistants were developed by programmers in connection with linguists to simulate real speech situations and create a specific discourse. In this case, our communication interacts with cognition, helping to visualize the virtual interlocutor according to his intonation, present, or attribute some features of his appearance, for example, correlating his voice with the timbre, ringing, or pronunciation of someone from our acquaintances. The problem with artificial intelligence is that it requires vast resources to develop. Of course, brand image is enhanced when a voice assistant in a smart speaker or other smart device can help plan your day, tell your child a bedtime story, or order groceries in the store while you are at work. But not every company or brand can afford to develop their own personal virtual interlocutor. So chatbots are subdivided into self-learning algorithm, for example, Alice from Yandex, and algorithm with a final script, for example, bots in social networks. As the development of the first time of chatbot, it seems to be quite expensive for the educational segment. In practice, it is easier to use the second type, a bot in which a person has put a written algorithm for responding to a message. And now I am going to pass turn to Anna Smirnova.
Thank you. The purpose of this study is chatbots in social networks with a finite algorithm and a communicative tool. The study of this object is considered from a linguistic point of view. Now I would like to say some words about instruments of research. The research is based on the junction of two sciences, linguistics and public relations. That's why the instruments that are used here are combined. Here the following research methods are chosen. A communicative pragmatic method and two methodics, a text analysis methodic and a discourse analysis methodic, and a cognitive method as well as a technique or one for analyzing concepts. From the point of view of public relations, here is used some methodic of communication complex analysis, which includes feature of social networks and SMM communication, communication policy of and communication policy of the company. So now some words about the result of this research. In this research, speech acts between chatbot and human in two different languages, and social networks are analyzed. Communication in the Telegram Messenger with the Health Step chatbot in English, and in social network Vkontakte with the MTS chatbot in the Russian language. These two objects of research are chatbots of commercial companies, the purpose of which is to make a profit. Here, I should say that the first bot we worked with was the Health Step chatbot, which operates in the Telegram Messenger and communicates in English. The first speech act turned out to be unsuccessful. The bot didn't execute the necessary commands, but the second act was crowned with success. It was possible to make appointment with the documentary. Linguistic analysis was carried out according to the methods which was described earlier. This slide shows the first communication option. Speech act between chatbot and person includes 7 different steps, and I will announce the most interesting steps and the result of the analysis. For example, step 4, which determines the structure of the text, we found 3 blocks of the text. 3 blocks without the 0 block. Exposure, it is the 0 level of the dialogue, which simply stands for the user had started communication with the chatbot Health Step. The first block, introductory part, it is greeting. Then the main part, which is definition of the functions of the bot and desire a person and desire of a person. And the third block is a conclusion where user comment not understood by the bot. Here is a curricular composition, as there is discrepancy between the capabilities of the bot and the desire of consumer. Accordingly, this speech act can be called a communicative follower. Step number 6 determines the stylistic features of the text. At this step, we turn again to the topic of internet linguistics and determine the feature of speech acts in social networks and in the internet. This can be abbreviations, colloquial vocabulary, the presence of exclamation marks, the presence of emoticons, and etc. The specificity of the channel actively influence the style of the text. Then step number 7 establishes the pragmatic essence of the text. As the author was a direct participant in these events, the author's intention is impressed in the text directly, which means that the text has pragmatics. The text has elocutionary power. The first communication experience wasn't successful. A second communication experience was successful, and I present it in this slide. Linguistic analysis, with the exception of this division of the text into parts, remains unchanged. The next methods is discourse analysis. It has 9 steps, and I will announce the most interesting steps and result of the analysis. So step 2 determines the type of discourse. The discourse is status oriented. From the point of view of modeling, most likely this text can be attributed to a conversation. Step number 3 deal with establishing the structure of discourse. This step form the basis of the communication algorithm presented on this slide. Step 7 deals with semantic and pragmatic features of the internet discourse. The discourse has the form of a question and answer dialogue with the imposed specific of communication with a program computer bot. The next method is analyzing of concepts. Let's recall the main stages of the concept methodology. Construction of the nominative field of the concept, analysis and description of the semantic of linguistic. Cognitive interpretation of the results of describing the semantic of linguistic means, and verification of the obtained cognitive description in native speakers. As the concept of health is quite widespread, its associative field has already been built in many studies. After analyzing a specific example of communication between chatbot and a person, the following features were identified. And now I would like to present it on this slide. The success or failure of communicative act is primarily determined by the relationship between the chatbots and the person's intention. In the communicative act, there is a change of roles. This makes it difficult to understand the object and subject of the communication. There are superimposed features of the communication channel. It is a social network. Then communicative discourse has a question and answer form. However, it can be considered unique. In the process of encoding and decoding information, an important role is played by the coincidence of the associative series in defining the concept. Another example is the communication with chatbot MTS. The dialogue with the MTS chatbot was analyzed in a similar way. You can see it on the slide here. We built the same algorithm for this, and you can see it here. We have same results of this research. The most interesting in this dialogue may be that communicative discourse has the form of button action. Communication occurs when a button is pressed, and maybe some different part from the algorithm of chatbot health tab. after having studied different types, we have came to the conclusion that today chatbots should be actively developed with a great emphasis on the linguistic component. This is necessary to improve the consumer's understanding of the subject of communication. In addition, competent bot step will help create an imitation of a real conversation with a company manager. As we know, during the pandemic, offline communication turned out to be almost impossible. And such bots help commercial organizations create familiar conditions for consumers in the online format around us and can take us live measured life when during the period of self-isolation.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. We have finished.
Thank you to both Svetlana and Anna for their presentation. And I would invite, last but not least, Yi-Chin Law, and I think Jin Cern Tam is doing the presenting for motivation for risk information seeking about COVID-19 among healthcare workers, a cross-sectional survey study.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yi-Chin from University Putra, Malaysia, and I'm also from Saran Medical Center, Velocity. My talk today is going to focus on motivation for risk information seeking about COVID-19 among healthcare workers. So first, I would like to acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Tam, in guiding me throughout this research and coming up this research idea and concept. Okay, so before I get into the focus study, I would like to give you a quick glance of COVID-19 situation in Malaysia. This data is as of July 4, 2021. Malaysia is currently on third wave, starting since September last year. And there was a sharp upward trend visible throughout the year. And now at its peak, more than 7,000, or to be exact, is 10,000 confirmed cases daily. In the beginning of the pandemic, there are about 1,700 cases of COVID-19 among healthcare workers. The cases have increased to about 3,390 cases of healthcare workers. So out of this number, there are about 2,341 cases among healthcare workers after vaccination got infected. And nurses and consultants or doctors were the largest healthcare workers groups with COVID-19 infections. So it is important to study risk communication as it's crucial for the prevention and control of infectious disease, especially when there is no clear solution to the disease in the beginning of the pandemic. Healthcare workers as frontliners are important as healthcare systems are mainly depend on them on whether they can cope with the crisis. Therefore, a well understanding of what influenced healthcare workers to seek information could help to strengthen the risk communication strategy to effectively respond to the crisis. So, past study also shows that internal stakeholders are often the source of rumors and miscommunication if risk communication is done poorly in an organization. So in this study, RSP model is used. This model is used in many studies in the context of communication setting related to health and environmental risks. So far, this model has not applied in Malaysia health communication thus far. Also, in comparison, there are a lot of research about COVID-19 focused on science perspective and are less visible in communication context. So this research is to aim to identify the intended risk information seeking among healthcare workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. And these are the specific variables we study. So according to WHO, risk communication is the exchange of real-time information, advice, and opinions between experts and people facing threats to their health, economic, or social well-being. We focus into information seeking because people make decisions based on the information they selected or seek through different channels. The general predictors to risk information seekings are information need and their belief on their relevant channels, perceived control, whether they're able to look for the information, their risk perception, and also social norms, and etc. Although perceived knowledge gap is the inevitable outcome of information seeking, however, seeking behavior are generally complex and there are still many uncertainties and limited research about it. So RSP model was suggested by Griffin and his colleague. It is one of the most comprehensive models to study what drives information seeking. Information need is the main concept of RSP model. It typically arises as the consequences of the perception of lack of information. This sense of information lack provokes one to develop a need for it. And this variable is also tied to uncertainty. The more uncertainty they feel about the risks, the higher the information need. So current knowledge is the perceived knowledge that the individual has for a certain topic. As part of information insufficiency, current knowledge is not associated with other models, concepts, but there are still other studies have indicated that current knowledge is an independent variable. So perceived risks include subjective judgments of the potential risks and the perception of the severity of the possible consequences. For effective response refers to the emotional aspects of risk perceptions, include both positive and negative feelings. So in this pandemic, we are most likely to feel negative, such as frequently feeling fear and worry. So for this organizational norm was adapted from one of the variables of the RSP model, which is information subjective norm. And this is also the contribution of this study. Organizational norms are created by a group of people in a firm or organization, such as superiors or colleagues, influence the behavior one engaged in. There are limited research on the associations between organizational norm and healthcare workers' risk information seeking. So this is the proposed research model, consisted of 5 independent variables to the dependent variable intended risk information seeking. So now I'd like to share some of the method. This study was conducted in Malaysia, Southern Medical Center and Southern Medical Center Velocity during the CMCO and TEMCO period from 25th November to 11 December 2020. So we use online and print survey. The questionnaire was shared in Google Form link and email blast to all healthcare workers from 2 hospitals. We also share the questionnaire through specific work WhatsApp group. We also print out the questionnaire and approach healthcare workers face-to-face who does not have emails such as cleaners, and face-to-face approach will also help to increase the response rate. We have a total of 415 respondents, and this is the breakdown of the health from the 2 hospitals. We use proportionate stratified random sampling methods to come up with 5 healthcare workers groups, which consisted of doctors, nurses, and midwives, allied health professional, managers, administrative officers, cleaners, and etc. The average age is 32 with standard deviation of 8.653. And these are the races and gender percentage. So most of the healthcare workers are female, which is 77.8%. So the reliability also test shows that the wearables are all have good levels of reliability and consistency. So this bar chart shows the main source respondent used to obtain COVID-19 information. We find that the highest main source were from official government websites, and second is internet, third is Facebook. And we also found that there are higher rate of respondent getting information from their colleague compared to their family and friends. And this is their education level of healthcare workers. 43% of them falls under diploma, A-level, pre-uni, and foundation category. Probably most of them are nurses. And based on our analysis, we found that respondents have high intention to seek COVID-19 information about the consequences of contracting COVID-19, about government measures, preventions, and so on. They also have rather high information need for COVID-19 informations. They perceive that they know how to prevent themselves and others from COVID-19, the symptoms of COVID-19, and they understand the situation in Malaysia and when they should go for COVID-19 screening. So in terms of organizational norm, they agree that their job positions and expectations of the employers, superiors, and colleagues influence them to know more about the COVID-19 risks. So we do a multiple regression analysis with stepwise procedure to identify the cause of and effect of the variables. The results show that 3 independent variables, information need, organizational norm, and current knowledge, correlate with the dependent variable intended information seeking. Perceived risks and effective response were rejected. So this model of regression shows that information need with beta 0.61 is the main indicator to influence the intended risk information seeking among healthcare workers. Organizational norm and current knowledge is the second and third important factor that directly associated with the dependent variable. So in conclusion, healthcare workers would actively seek for risk information when they perceive themselves lack of information. Hence, we suggest that the organization to increase risk awareness among staff and or among healthcare workers, constantly providing them with COVID-19 updates through departmental meetings or town hall meetings. We also suggest to use easy to understand infographic to persuade staff to follow SOPs and show what causes of infections and death and which were preventable. Current knowledge is important for healthcare workers when they need to perform their duties as frontliners. So healthcare workers who possess high current knowledge are more confident when they perform their duty during the pandemic. So our findings also show that healthcare workers who are more knowledgeable about the topic are more likely to search for additional information. Hence, we suggest that the organization can organize more talks and trainings for healthcare workers. This will help them to provide guidance for staff when working in hospital. And lastly, healthcare workers who felt higher pressure from their superiors and colleagues were more likely to search the risks and safety information. So for this, we suggest to promote transparency, open communications, and increased engagement with healthcare workers. Many of the infections cases happen due to the negligence of following SOPs, for instance, lunch gathering without social distancing in the office, So leaders in the hospital, like medical director or infectious control physicians, should constantly remind the staff to be responsible and follow SOPs. This can create more pressure for all the staff to follow accordingly. And also the leaders should also be the role models for the staff. So that's all for my sharing today. Before I end my talk, I would like to thank Soil Medical Centers and University Putra Malaysia for supporting me to do this research. And thank you everyone for listening to my presentations. Thank you our frontliners who are working tirelessly to save life every day. And I hope everyone stay healthy and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you both, and thanks to all of our presenters. I know that we are in technically our transition period to the next session, but because we don't have to find our new rooms or anything like that, I would invite us to have as much conversation as we want before heading off into next sessions. But I certainly also understand if people need to go to their next session too. So with that, I would invite anyone to jump in with questions or comments to any of our presenters this morning or today. And we've had a robust discussion going in the chat as well. So I thank you for those. One thing that I'll kind of kick off a question. I know we have a couple of folks from Russia here. Natalia, when you're talking about the importance of SCS or the student satisfaction, how important of a measure is that? I know it's a huge measure in the UK, in a lot of places. Is that also a growing and important measure for you guys as well?
Well, thank you for the question. Well, student communication satisfaction is a really important evaluating mechanism at our university. At the end of each term, students at High School of Economics should give their feedback on the work of each teacher. They have to give because it's obligatory. Well, and questions are given in learning management system. And I think students' responses reflect their satisfaction, their communication satisfaction with their teachers. And on the basis of the responses, we have a kind of rating system. Well, and I think it's, well, essential. Well, it's important for, well, it's an important evaluating mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Anne and Svetlana, as you're talking about the bots and the notion of language and culture, I think it's interesting that there's some important distinctions between education, game, and medical chatbots. What do you guys see as some of the critical differences in those contexts?
Well, I quite agree so with your comment that so it is really it seems so to reflect so the interactions with such technology which so we find frustrating. So yes, so to say
what
the least, quite agree, but nevertheless it is the real state, so the real life, so the real situation in the world, what to do.
I don't, you talked to, can I just say something on that, on the chat bots? And you talked about PR in there. And I actually wonder whether organizations actually understand how much of a negative PR badly designed chatbots really are.
Well, maybe. So we will think about it. So maybe. Anna Smirnova, so she is a public relations specialist. I am a linguist. So we wanted to combine these two points, these two sciences, and to make cool. So to make some researches.
Yeah, no, it's cool. It is cool, but they are frustrating little beasts.
Yes,
chatbots.
I quite agree. Yeah.
Can I ask, sorry, can I ask a question of Natalia, please? Just talking about, we've all been thrust into this online learning environment. I come from a university that is known for distance education anyway, but even for us being thrust into nearly a purely online learning environment has been extremely difficult. Has it been the same for you?
Well, partly. Well, personally speaking, I think I was lucky because my students, well, they have specialization in computer programming. And I think, well, it seemed to me that was no difference for them to communicate online or offline. But I know that for many students, and especially for teachers, it was extremely difficult because some teachers, well, I have an impression that many teachers have, they think that online communication and offline communication face-to-face, are practically the same. But I think you can agree they are completely different. And it's extremely difficult to have contact, even to have eye contact with students. Well, you should have a kind of, habit. Well, yeah. That's it. Thank you.
That's right.
And I have a question for Yi-Chin and Jinsern. In your research, one of the later things that you talked about was where people were getting their information. And happily, from the government was the primary source. But what's also interesting was still the reliance on interpersonal WhatsApp or social media sources. How do you see in Malaysia the kind of tension between information and misinformation with regards to COVID?
All right, thank you for the question, Audra. So, of course, I think not just Malaysia, right? I think the whole world is facing this challenge: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And we also see exponential growth of these fake news in relation to COVID-19 vaccination. So initially, I'm talking from Malaysia perspective. Initially, we had a rule, right, to govern this fake news spread out in the community. But this rule is quite controversial, right, and receive a lot of outcry from the public. So in relation to fake news and misinformation, particularly in relation to COVID-19, we still see, I just presented paper before this session, which even though some public, I would say some of them, they know they should not share this, and they are able to identify, right, the genuine of the news and also information from various aspects, for example, the source, the date, and whatnot. When it comes to that's in relation to politics. But when in relation to health, because a lot of uncertainty, right, and abundance of information spread out on the internet and social media, we see another situation, not just misinformation, but we also see information overload, right, among these people. And because of this consequence of information overload, then we see pandemic fatigue, right, among our generations or even in the community. So I would say that it's very challenging, right, not just in Malaysia, but all around the world, we are facing this. So what we can do as health communication scholars is, of course, we have to create a platform to discuss, create a venue, right, to discuss this misinformation and also teach our public where they can actually fact check, right, this information from particular websites or sources.
Thank you. And I think that, yeah, that's teaching information sophistication. And is probably not just related to COVID, but I think that that's probably what we need more broadly speaking. And I think people are starting, it seems like in a lot of places, this is for the normal folks. We'll separate the conspiracy theorists out from this, but COVID seems to have been the first time in a while that we've genuinely relied on experts and have had that conversation about good and bad information as a global society, which is, I don't know, small moment for me to be optimistic in a very otherwise cynical life. Thank you. Thanks to all the presenters. Thanks to the folks who have come to see the presentations. Any other comments or questions?
Thank you a lot. It was very interesting. All the presentations so wonderful. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you. That was really interesting.
Well, then have a great rest of your day, night, and conference.
Yes.
Hey, everyone.
So goodbye, everybody. So thank you a lot. So we were very pleased to take part at this conference. It was wonderful. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye,
Goodbye.
Natalia.
Goodbye.
Svetlana.
Goodbye.
Right, Audra, I will catch you on soon. Okay, mate? I'm on tomorrow, so I'll catch you soon. I'm now going to go and watch the All Blacks. Okay. See you later.
Cheers. Later.
Cheers, mate. Bye.